Welcome back. Today we'll be talking about Chapter 3, Section 2 of the Textbook of Americans. Section 3 is the Commercial North. Let me get it right this time. It is actually Chapter 3, Section 3. It talks about the Commercial North, the northern colonies during the pre-revolutionary era. The northern colonies, unlike the South, were predominantly urban. They had a diversified economy. They had cold winters, rocky soil, and that kept them to small farms, basically, not large plantations like existed in the South. In the middle colonies, they were able to raise livestock and crops, and they exported the surplus. In New England itself, due to this lack of crops, or in reality, any large amount of livestock, they actually spent most of their time doing commerce, serving as the conduit, I guess you could say almost the middleman for goods and services between the other colonies and England. By the mid-1700s, merchants became a very powerful group in the North. This growth in trade led to large cities developing like New York and Boston, mainly centered around ports. And that's one of the themes that goes on throughout history. Major cities are almost always situated upon water routes, either large rivers or ports. And a port is a city that has docks and a bay generally. Philadelphia, the second largest city in the British Empire, had an urban plan. So imagine this, larger than Manchester, larger than Liverpool, second only to London, and eventually it would become bigger than London. The Northern society is much more diverse, or was much more diverse than the Southern colonies. Not only was there a large influx from the Germans, Scotch, Irish, and the Dutch, you also had Jews, you had Eastern Europeans, you had Native Irish, but the immigrants did encounter prejudice. And as you continue to move further on the frontier, more clashes with Native Americans. There was much less slavery in the North than in the South, but prejudice still exists. Just because you eradicate slavery does not mean you necessarily eradicate prejudice. Slaves in the North had more legal rights, but they were still restricted. Women in the North had extensive work responsibilities, but they had few legal rights as well. Only single women or widows could own a business, and again, wives must submit to their husbands, according to the culture of the time. In Salem, Massachusetts, and we will watch a video on this, in Salem, Massachusetts, you had the famous Salem witch trials, which began in 1692, where false accusations of witchcraft led to people being executed. Many of the accusers were poor, and they brought charges against the rich. This is an example of socioeconomic factors, hysteria, and religious fervor all bleeding into something that turned into be very disastrous. Several victims were women who were considered too independent, such as a tavern owner. The Enlightenment that you studied in the 8th grade had an impact upon the colonies. For centuries, philosophers used reason and science to explain the world. The Enlightenment movement in the 1700s emphasized reason and observation, and it spread quickly through books and pamphlets. Benjamin Franklin, an American, is considered one of the heroes of the Enlightenment. He embraced the ideas of the Enlightenment. And other colonial leaders, such as Thomas Jefferson, would also embrace these Enlightenment ideas. History is a series of reactions. Please understand that. And as we move further, we have to understand on one side you had reason. The reaction to the reason was an increased religious fervor. In this case, it's known as the Great Awakening. Puritans had lost their grip on Massachusetts society. They actually had to come up with a deal where you didn't have to get saved, quote unquote, to be a member of the church, and it was called the Halfway Covenant. Jonathan Edwards was an itinerant preacher. Well, he wasn't that itinerant. He was educated. But anyway, he was a poor preacher who preached that people are sinful and must seek God's mercy. In English, you will study a book called, or a pamphlet called, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. This led to a religious revival of the 1730s and the 1740s, known as the Great Awakening. Native Americans, African Americans, people from all over joined the new churches that popped up. Baptists, Methodists, other groups sprang out of pretty much the mist. Some of these groups had been pre-existing, but as a result of the Great Awakening, they really multiplied and expanded. As a result of most religious fervor, interest in learning increases in the academic areas. Colleges were founded. However, in scientific areas, the interest in learning tended to decrease. Both movements, both the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening, questioned authority, and they stressed the importance of the individual. That concludes Section 3, Chapter 3 of the Americans. I will see you on the next lecture, Section 4.